Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Thursday, January 22nd, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 66.4 degrees, with a low dipping to 53.0, so expect a mild winter day with some chill in the evening. Coming up, we'll break down the reasons behind Winter Storm Fern's potential to bring destructive winds and flooding, reminiscent of a hurricane across much of the United States. We'll also examine President Trump's strategies to curb Wall Street's influence on the housing sector and stabilize home prices for everyday Americans. Plus, other key stories on global tensions, tech innovations, and local impacts. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We are tracking a massive and dangerous winter storm this morning, already named Winter Storm Fern. Ethan is with us to break down what this means from Texas to the Carolinas and beyond. Ethan, how big is this outbreak, and who is in the crosshairs today?
Fern is enormous, Grace. Meteorologists are calling it a potentially generational Arctic outbreak, something you might only see a few times in a lifetime. The Associated Press reports it could affect roughly half of everyone living in the lower 48 states, from New Mexico and Texas, all the way through the Deep South, the Mid-Atlantic, and into New England. As of today, the National Weather Service has winter storm and extreme cold alerts stretching across well over a dozen states, and that number is likely to grow.
Let's talk timing. When do conditions really start to go downhill, and how long could this last?
Parts of the Southwest and Southern Plains start feeling the first punches today, January 22nd. According to the National Weather Service forecast cited by the Washington Post, the storm ramps up aggressively tomorrow, Friday, January 23rd, and then peaks through this coming weekend into Sunday, January 25th. What really worries forecasters is that the brutal cold does not just leave once the snow stops. AP reporting says sub-freezing air may linger into early February, which could slow power restoration and cleanup.
Meteorologists keep comparing this storm to a major hurricane. What makes Fern so extreme and different from a typical cold snap?
It is the size, the intensity, and the combination of threats all at once. We are talking about a cold dome stretching roughly 2,000 miles, riding along key highways like Interstates 20, 35, and 40, with heavy snow on the north side and crippling ice in the middle. The AP notes that between about 175 and more than 200 million people could see dangerous wind chills, snow, ice, or some mix of all three. One meteorologist quoted by the AP said the setup is like having, quote, two blizzards on top of each other, end quote, near places like Washington, D.C.
You mentioned the setup. A lot of this centers on the polar vortex. In plain English, what has gone wrong up there?
The polar vortex is that huge whirl of cold air that normally spins above the Arctic. In this case, forecasters say it has been stretched like a rubber band, sending a long lobe of frigid air deep into the United States instead of staying neatly parked over northern Canada. The Associated Press, in a detailed piece carried by the Winnipeg Free Press, explains that this is not a split vortex with separate chunks breaking off, but an elongated one that can keep cold locked over us for weeks. Former NOAA chief scientist Ryan Mao told the AP that the atmosphere has, quote, aligned perfectly, end quote, for a hemisphere-wide deep freeze, with the coldest core dropping over places like Duluth, Minnesota by tomorrow morning.
So what is stretching that rubber band? We are hearing about sea ice, atmospheric rivers, and even Siberia. How do those pieces fit together?
One part of the story is the Arctic itself. The National Snow and Ice Data Center has documented record low sea ice in the Barents and Kara Seas late last year, and the AP reports that open water there releases extra heat and moisture into the atmosphere, which can weaken the polar vortex's grip. At the same time, there is an atmospheric river, a fire hose of warm, wet air running in from the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico. Fox weather models, cited by Fox 7 Austin, show that river smashing into the incoming Arctic air, turning all that moisture into broad swaths of heavy snow and freezing rain.
And how about that international piece, the cold over Europe and Siberia the last few months?
According to coverage in the Houston Chronicle and The Guardian, Eastern Europe, Siberia, and North America all built up large cold pools this winter. Heavy snows in Siberia since last October helped set up a kind of tug-of-war in the upper atmosphere, reinforcing this stretched vortex pattern. Those regions act like anchors on the jet stream, helping bend it and allowing Arctic air to surge south repeatedly instead of just one quick snap. The result is what we are seeing with Fern, not just a sharp blast, but waves of cold that can reload.
Whenever we see a monster winter storm, the question comes up, is climate change behind this? What are scientists saying about Fern and the stretched vortex pattern?
There is an active debate. Judah Cohen at MIT, whose work is cited by the AP and summarized by NPR and The Washington Post, argues that rapidly warming Arctic regions and low sea ice have, in his words, loaded the dice for more of these stretched vortex events. His studies in journals like Science and Nature Communications link low Barents Kara ice and heavy Siberian snow to the kind of wavy jet stream we are seeing this week. But other researchers, highlighted by NOAA and the IPCC's recent assessments, caution that the overall trend is fewer cold extremes worldwide as the planet warms, even if a few of them remain very intense.
So there is disagreement, even among experts. What do the skeptics of that Arctic-driven explanation argue?
Scientists like Russell Blackport and James Screen at the University of Exeter, quoted in The Washington Post, say the evidence for a strong causal link is still weak. They argue that natural climate patterns like La Niña, the North Atlantic Oscillation, and a sudden stratospheric warming earlier this month can explain both the Arctic changes and our mid-latitude cold, without needing a direct line from sea ice loss to storms like Fern. The Arctic Report Card, summarized by NPR, notes that models only have low to medium confidence in a strong Arctic driver for these specific cold outbreaks. One way to think of it, as some researchers frame it, is that sea ice might set the stage, but internal atmospheric chaos and tropical influences still decide when the curtain actually goes up.
Let's bring this back down to the ground. For someone waking up in, say, Oklahoma City or Nashville, what kind of temperatures are we talking about over the next few days?
National Weather Service projections, pulled together by Fox 7 Austin and AOL, suggest national average low temperatures for the lower 48 could sink to around the low teens Fahrenheit by Saturday through Monday. Across the northern plains and upper Midwest, that likely means actual air temperatures in the -20s or even close to -30, with wind chills dropping to around -50 in the coldest pockets of northern Minnesota and North Dakota. For most of the central and eastern United States, including cities like Oklahoma City and Nashville, we are looking at teens or single digits at best, with wind chills below zero. The AP estimates about 230 million people will see highs or lows at or below around 20 degrees.
And then you stack snow and ice on top of that cold. Which areas look like they will get the heaviest snow from Fern?
Forecasters expect a broad snow shield from the southern plains through the Ohio and Tennessee valleys and into the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. According to the AP and National Weather Service briefings, many areas in that zone could see around 6 to 12 inches of snow, with some pockets topping a foot or more. That includes a swath from central Oklahoma into northern Arkansas, through parts of Tennessee and western North Carolina, and then up the Interstate 95 corridor from Washington, D.C. to New York City, and possibly Boston. One National Weather Service meteorologist, Zach Taylor, told the AP to expect, quote, another significant swath of heavy snow, end quote, across that region.
For the South, the real fear seems to be ice, not just snow. How bad could the freezing rain be?
The ice threat may be the most catastrophic part of this storm. The Weather Service and Fox weather models show a corridor of freezing rain from East Texas across southern Arkansas and into the deep South and Carolinas, including major metros like Dallas-Fort Worth, Atlanta, Augusta, and Charlotte. According to the AP, some of those places could see around half an inch of ice or more glazed onto trees and power lines, which is easily enough to snap limbs and bring down distribution lines. Because temperatures stay below freezing for days afterward, the ice will not melt quickly, so any outages could last well into next week.
That has obvious implications for travel. What should people expect if they are flying or driving through those southern and mid-Atlantic hubs?
Airlines have already started issuing travel waivers for tomorrow through Sunday, especially for itineraries going through Dallas-Fort Worth, Atlanta, Memphis, Charlotte, and likely Nashville as well. According to AOL's roundup of airline statements, carriers like American, Delta, and United are warning of widespread cancellations if the ice forecast holds. On the roads, long-haul truck drivers in Oklahoma told the AP they are deeply worried about jackknifed rigs and pile-ups once those interstates glaze over. One driver put it bluntly, saying, quote, "One mistake can literally kill somebody," end quote, on icy highways.
Power is another big concern here, especially after what Texans went through back in 2021. How are the grids preparing this time?
The Texas grid operator ERCOT has issued what it calls a weather watch from this Saturday through next Tuesday, watching for huge demand and thinner reserves. The Texas Tribune and Fox 7 Austin report that major utilities like Oncor and CenterPoint have mobilized roughly 3,300 workers and contractors to respond to outages. In the southeast, rural electric cooperatives are warning that heavy ice can create a domino effect, where one snapped pole pulls several more down and wipes out whole stretches of line. Officials in the Carolinas and Tennessee are treating this very much like a hurricane-style threat, just with ice instead of wind and storm surge.
We have talked about states and utilities, but what about city-level preparations, especially in places that do not usually see major ice storms?
There is a big contrast between northern and southern cities. AP reporting relayed by AOL describes how Jackson, Mississippi has no dedicated snowplows at all, relying instead on things like skid steers and a few salt and sand trucks. Memphis has only a small fleet of snow and ice trucks, while Nashville has ramped up to about 45 plows, including the ones locals jokingly named Dolly Plowton and Snowline. Compare that with Chicago, where the Chicago Tribune notes the city can roll out roughly 330 plows and a fleet of support vehicles, even spraying beet juice on roads because it helps road salt work better in extreme cold.
Governors from Texas to the Carolinas have been holding briefings. What specific steps are states taking ahead of Fern?
Texas Governor Greg Abbott activated statewide emergency resources yesterday, according to Fox 7 Austin and the Texas Tribune, sending out more than 1,000 pieces of equipment like snowplows, graders, and brine trucks to treat roads, especially around Dallas-Fort Worth. North and South Carolina have both declared states of emergency, which lets them move National Guard troops and utility crews into position before the worst ice hits. Maryland's governor issued what he called a state of preparedness to speed up any potential response along the Mid-Atlantic corridor. In Tennessee, transportation officials say they have hundreds of salt and brine trucks ready to go, knowing that even a little ice can shut down their interstates.
For people listening right now in the path of this storm, what should they be doing today and tomorrow to get ready?
The National Weather Service, along with outlets like ABC News and CNN, is urging people to think about both staying warm and staying put. That means layering clothing, covering exposed skin, and avoiding travel during the peak of the storm if at all possible, because wind chills could fall to around -50 in some northern spots and still be dangerously low farther south. Officials also recommend having at least about 3 days of food, water, essential medicines, and fuel or battery power in case roads or power are out, and they stress checking on neighbors who are elderly or live alone. Those are often the people most at risk in prolonged cold.
Mentally, some folks may look outside, see just clouds for now, and think this is overhyped. How are experts addressing that sense of complacency?
Meteorologists keep reminding people how quickly conditions can unravel with a setup like this. Ryan Mao told the Winnipeg Free Press that he believes, quote, "People are underestimating just how bad it is going to be," end quote, especially in the ice zone. Because Fern's imprint is so large and the cold so deep, forecasters compare potential disruptions to a strong hurricane making landfall, with long-lasting power problems, water issues from frozen pipes, and major travel paralysis. The message from NOAA and the Weather Channel is clear: it is far better to prepare and be pleasantly surprised than to be caught off guard.
As Fern unfolds over the next several days, what should people watch for in terms of changing forecasts or new risks?
The big thing is that the precise rain-snow-ice line will wiggle, and that determines who gets heavy snow versus crippling ice. The Weather Channel and CNN both note that even a small north or south shift of that zone can change impacts dramatically for any given city, especially across Texas, Arkansas, Georgia, and the Carolinas. People should keep checking updated alerts from the National Weather Service and local officials, because watches can quickly upgrade to warnings as confidence grows. And remember, even once the snow and ice stop falling, the lingering cold into early February means the danger does not end when the radar clears.
A lot to stay on top of in the days ahead. Ethan, thanks for walking us through Winter Storm Fern this morning. The White House is rolling out some big housing moves aimed at making it easier to buy a home after several very tough years. Our Chloe is with us to break down what President Trump just announced. Chloe, what is the big picture here?
Grace, the administration is trying to show it is tackling the affordability crisis that has been dragging on since about 2022. According to reporting from the Associated Press and U.S. News and World Report, the strategy really has two pillars: squeeze big investors out of the starter home market and push interest rates lower. The timing is political as well as economic, with the White House explicitly framing this as part of its affordability agenda heading into the 2026 midterms. The question is whether these moves actually change the math for first-time buyers.
Let's start with that investor piece. What exactly did the president sign this week?
On Monday, January 20th, the president signed an executive order called, quote, "Stopping Wall Street from Competing with Main Street Homebuyers," end quote. In his speech yesterday at the World Economic Forum in Davos, he said, quote, "Homes are built for people, not for corporations, and America will not become a nation of renters," end quote, according to AP coverage picked up by KCRG-TV9 in Iowa. Instead of making it a crime for corporations to buy homes, the order goes after the financing it tells agencies like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development to stop backing mortgages when large institutional investors buy existing single-family houses. The administration is hoping that, over time, this makes it harder and more expensive for big funds to outbid families.
So does this mean a total ban on corporate landlords buying houses?
Not quite. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been clarifying in Davos this week that this is forward-looking only, so companies are not being forced to sell off the homes they already own. He even used the phrase, quote, "Bygones are bygones," end quote, which Politico and AP both noted, because that sidesteps some of the hardest constitutional fights over taking property. And there is an important carve-out: companies that build homes specifically to rent, those build-to-rent subdivisions, are exempt, so the order does not choke off new construction. So you can think of this less as a ban and more as putting speed bumps in front of large investors who want to keep scooping up existing starter homes.
You mentioned large investors. How is the administration deciding who counts as large?
That is still a moving target. Secretary Bessent has about 30 days from this week, so into mid-February, to nail down the final definition. But he has floated a surprisingly low threshold, as few as a dozen homes. The idea, according to U.S. News and World Report, is to separate so-called aggregators from retirees or small landlords who own maybe 5 or 10 properties. Once that line is drawn, those larger players would be cut off from federal backing through things like FHA and VA loans, and regulators would dig more into who really owns web after web of limited liability companies that have been used to buy properties quietly.
Would first-time buyers actually get first crack at more homes under this order?
That is the hope, and the order does lean into that. It tells agencies to strengthen what are called first-look programs, where foreclosed or government-owned homes must be offered initially to individual buyers and nonprofits for a set period, often about 30 days, before investors are allowed to bid. According to coverage on WDRB in Louisville and AP Business Reporting, the White House is framing this as a fairness play. Regular buyers get a clean shot without competing immediately against an all-cash hedge fund offer. The catch is that the number of homes that come through those channels is relatively small compared with the entire market.
A lot of people blame Wall Street landlords for high prices. Do the numbers back that up nationwide?
Nationally, not really. Data from Redfin, the Urban Institute, the Government Accountability Office, and the National Association of Realtors all show that the really big landlords, the ones owning more than 1,000 homes, control only about 1 to 3% of all single-family houses across the country. In the rental slice of that market, their share is a bit higher, roughly 3 to 5%, and in some southern metros like Atlanta, Charlotte, Jacksonville, and Phoenix, they account for something like 15 to 25% of rentals. But more than 80% of single-family rentals are still owned by small individual landlords, and those owners are not touched by this executive order.
If their footprint is that small, do economists think this crackdown will move prices much?
Many are skeptical. Redfin's chief economist Daryl Fairweather told reporters the policy, quote, probably will not make a noticeable impact, end quote, on overall affordability because it goes after what she calls a visible symptom, not the underlying disease. Realtor.com senior economist Jake Krimmel and National Association of Realtors economist Lawrence Yun both point to the same root causes, a shortage of roughly 4 to 6 million homes after more than a decade of underbuilding, tight local zoning that blocks denser housing, and what they call a lock-in effect, where owners sitting on ultra-low mortgage rates simply refuse to sell. So where investors are very active, you might see some relief on the margins, but experts told HousingWire they do not expect a nationwide reset in prices from this alone.
How has Wall Street reacted so far? Are investors spooked by this order?
The market reaction has been pretty subdued. Shares of big single-family rental trusts like Invitation Homes dipped about 1.33% on Monday, then clawed most of that back by yesterday, according to price data cited by Benzinga and Macro Trends. American Homes 4 Rent saw a similar tiny drop and rebound. Analysts at Mizuho Americas even called the order a, quote, nothing burger, end quote, noting that the largest firms often rely on private credit or cash rather than the federal guarantees this order targets.
And what about the legal side? Could this order get struck down in court?
That is a real possibility. Legal scholars quoted in Politico Pro say challengers are almost certain to invoke the Supreme Court's so-called major questions doctrine, which says agencies need clear congressional approval before making big economic shifts. There are also potential Fifth Amendment fights over whether limiting the pool of buyers unfairly devalues existing holdings, and Administrative Procedure Act claims if the definition of a large investor looks arbitrary. On top of that, regulators themselves acknowledge that 70 to 80% of institutional purchases are all cash or financed without federal backing, so the executive branch may be swinging hardest at the part of the market it actually touches least.
Have states or Congress tried anything similar before, and how did those efforts go?
There have been attempts, and they show how tough this is to enforce. In 2023, lawmakers in states like California and Minnesota floated or passed bills to limit big investor buying, but industry lobbying and vetoes watered most of them down. At the federal level, proposals with names like the End Hedge Fund Control of American Homes Act generated headlines, then stalled out. There is some bipartisan interest, for example Nevada's Home Act, but as U.S. News and others note, the Senate Banking Committee is bogged down with other priorities, so turning this executive order into durable law could take a long time.
Let's shift to the other big piece, interest rates. What is the administration doing on that front?
The president is leaning hard on borrowing costs as the quickest way to help buyers and existing owners. At Davos, he called for interest rates that are, quote, good for everybody, end quote, and pointed to a new plan for the federal government to buy about $200 billion of mortgage-backed securities using Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac cash reserves. The goal, according to coverage from CBS News and Housing Wire, is to push mortgage rates down a bit by increasing demand for those bonds. It is somewhat similar to what the Federal Reserve did earlier in the decade, but on a smaller, more targeted scale.
Do experts think those mortgage bond purchases will really move rates much lower?
Not dramatically, at least not on their own. Economists at Freddie Mac and the New York Fed note that when the central bank cut rates in 2024, 30-year mortgages actually crept back above 7% by January of last year because broader Treasury yields were rising. As of last week, Freddie Mac's survey showed average 30-year rates around 6.06%, and by today they are hovering between roughly 6.1% and 6.2%, according to Bankrate and Mortgage News Daily. That is the lowest in about 3 years and has triggered a 40% jump in refinance applications. But analysts told Housing Wire we would probably need more Federal Reserve cuts after this spring to get down near 5%.
The president also talked about the Fed itself. What is changing there?
He has made it clear he wants a more dovish central bank. The White House says it plans to name a new Federal Reserve chair by May of this year to replace Jerome Powell when his term expires. And the president has been publicly urging the Fed to cut rates faster. But as a AP reporting on a separate Supreme Court case around Governor Lisa Cook points out, the court seems wary of letting presidents fire independent Fed officials at will, so there are limits on how directly he can pull those levers. That tension between political pressure and Fed independence will shape how far and how fast borrowing costs can fall.
Beyond mortgages, what is the administration doing to help people actually save for a down payment?
There are a couple of ideas on the table. The president has asked Congress for a 1-year cap on credit card interest rates at 10% after card companies ignored a voluntary request on Monday. The average rate right now is about 21%, so in theory that frees up cash for savings. He is also pushing to let people tap their 401k retirement accounts or 529 college savings for down payments without the usual early withdrawal penalties, something CBS News says could be popular but risky for long-term retirement security. And there is a proposal for so-called portable mortgages, letting homeowners carry their low existing rate to a new house, which might thaw the lock-in effect that has kept many would-be sellers frozen in place.
You mentioned supply earlier. Are there any concrete building plans tied to this housing push?
The administration keeps pointing to a broader initiative it calls Great American Home Building. According to U.S. News and Housing Wire, the idea is to use some federal land and incentives to spur more construction, and to lean on cities to relax zoning that blocks duplexes or small apartment buildings in single-family neighborhoods. But even the White House has been cautious in its language, warning that overcorrecting could, in the president's words, quote, crush the housing market, end quote, by knocking down prices too fast for roughly 70 million existing homeowners who have benefited from soaring values. So far, those supply-side plans are more outline than finished blueprint.
Given all that, how do economists think these moves will actually play out for buyers this year and next?
The consensus is cautiously modest. Analysts at the AEI Housing Center and Goldman Sachs, cited by several outlets, say the investor restrictions and rate moves together might shave prices by maybe 5 to 10% in a few markets where Wall Street buying has been especially intense. But they warn that anything which juice demand, like easier access to retirement savings, could simply bid prices back up if the underlying shortage of homes is not fixed. In other words, you could make it easier to get a loan but still have too many people chasing too few houses.
Politically, how much pressure is the White House under to show progress here?
Quite a bit. Surveys by AAPI Data and AP NORC show that about half of Asian American and Pacific Islander adults and large shares of other groups rank inflation and everyday costs as their top concern. Younger voters in particular, many of whom have been locked out of homeownership since the 2022 slump began, are a key target for this Main Street versus Wall Street messaging. But with Congress slow to move on things like credit card caps and zoning incentives, much of what the administration can do quickly rests on executive actions that may be narrower and more fragile than voters expect.
So for someone listening who is hoping to buy their first home, what is the bottom line right now?
In the short term, the biggest tangible change is slightly lower mortgage rates than we saw a year ago, which can help a little with monthly payments. The investor order may open up a bit of inventory in certain neighborhoods over time, but experts from Redfin, the National Association of Realtors, and Realtor.com all stress that the fundamental problem is a long-running shortage of homes, not just Wall Street competition. Unless building ramps up meaningfully and local zoning eases, the relief from these moves is likely to feel incremental rather than transformational. For now, buyers are getting some breathing room, but not a full reset of the housing market.
A lot of moving pieces, and clearly a long road ahead for affordability. Chloe, thanks for walking us through it. Here are some other headlines. In Washington, the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform is turning up the Capitol pressure on the Clintons. Lawmakers voted to recommend holding former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in criminal contempt of Congress for defying subpoenas tied to their dealings with Jeffrey Epstein and the handling of related federal cases. The resolution against Bill Clinton passed 34-8, with 9 Democrats crossing the aisle. The measure targeting Hillary Clinton passed 28-15, with 3 Democratic votes. Chairman James Comer says months of negotiations over deposition terms broke down after the committee rejected the Clintons' offer to speak off transcript. The full House is expected to vote in February in a move that could send a criminal referral to the Justice Department and, theoretically, carry up to a year behind bars, turning executive privilege into potentially corrective privilege. In Iran, the government has finally put a number on the unrest that shook the country since late December, but critics say the math doesn't add up. State media and the Martyrs Foundation report 117 dead nationwide, with the National Security Council labeling 427 as innocent civilians and security forces, and 690 as terrorists or rioters. Independent monitors say that narrative is a hard sell. The rights group HRANA has verified at least 902 deaths, while diaspora networks estimate the toll could reach 20,000. Authorities blame the bloodshed on alleged U.S. and Israeli interference and maintain a near-total internet blackout, cutting the web to control the story's thread. Observers call it the deadliest crackdown in the Islamic Republic's history, triggered by the rial's collapse, and note that new sanctions and rising regional tensions now have Tehran's foreign minister warning of all-out confrontation if more pressure is applied. In Bangladesh, democracy is back on the ballot, literally and figuratively. Official campaigning for the 13th national parliamentary election kicked off January 22, after the Election Commission assigned symbols to 973 candidates ahead of the February 12 vote. It's the first election since the 2024 student-led uprising that ousted longtime Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Her Awami League remains suspended from the race. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by Tariq Rahman, launched its campaign with a rally in Sylhet, while Jamaat al-Islami opened its bid in Dhaka. An extended voting day will also accommodate a referendum on the July Charter, proposed constitutional reforms that could reshape the presidency and lock in term limits. Under the interim government of Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, a massive Gen Z bloc, about 44% of voters, joins international observers, including a Commonwealth team led by former Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo, to see whether this transition adds up to real change, not just ballot box buzzwords. Back in the United States, a new report suggests the murder rate is getting killed. The Council on Criminal Justice says homicides in major cities dropped 21% in 2025, continuing a slide that now totals 44% since the 2021 peak. The projected national rate, around 4 killings per 100,000 residents, could be the lowest since records began in 1900. Of 35 cities with data, 31 saw declines, with Denver, Omaha, and Washington, D.C. reporting drops of roughly 40%. Analysts say there's no single smoking gun for the decline. They point instead to a blend of shifting policies, improved technology, and a return to pre-pandemic routines. Still, some crime categories, including drug offenses, remain stubbornly high, ensuring that debates over public safety funding and violence intervention programs won't be going quietly. And finally, the new dietary guidelines for Americans are serving up controversy a la mode, full-fat mode. The 2025 to 2030 guidelines, unveiled by HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins, flip the traditional food pyramid on its head, putting protein and full-fat dairy on top and pushing grains and fruits down the plate. The plan nearly doubles recommended protein intake to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight and scraps specific daily alcohol limits in favor of the fuzzy advice to consume less, a toast to ambiguity. Public health advocates warn the guidelines sideline decades of research on saturated fat and heart disease, while dairy and meat producers are milking the moment and beefing up their praise. Because these standards guide meals for 30 million children through the National School Lunch Program and shape SNAP and WIC benefits, schools say the shift to costlier, whole foods may take until 2027 to fully digest. Critics also note that several recommendations from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, especially on ultra-processed foods, were left on the cutting room floor, highlighting a widening gap between political taste and scientific seasoning. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.